Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. We're coming to Wild Ag Podcast. We have today in the room a great speaker we're going to have and talk about some topics on predator management. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm John Carroll, professor of wildlife ecology here at the University of Nebraska. And most of my career, I've worked on game birds, and I've had a fair amount of experience looking at predation issues and predator management and all of that. And so I have a fair amount of experience in that space.
Sounds great. Nathan?
Absolutely. And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever. And I'm really excited to have Dr. Carroll on today because when I'm out on the landscape working with producers, enrolling their acres in different sorts of conservation contracts, predator management is always one of those questions that comes up.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I would say, revolves around raccoons and coyotes when we're out there on the landscape, but sometimes even turkeys come up in conversation too. So sure. I'm hoping that we can pick John's brain today and kind of clear some of those questions up that I get from landowners.
Sure, yeah. Yep. And I'm Dr. Andrew Little. I'm a professor here in the School of Natural Resources. Work a lot in the realm of precision conservation, basically finding that balance for ag and conservation landscape, as well as game species, pheasants, turkeys, deer, pronghorn, all those and above. So yeah, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Excited to have John on today. And so Nathan, I'll kick it to you as a co-host here, maybe to get us started.
Absolutely. So I kind of mentioned that predators come up quite often when I'm working with producers out on the landscape, but for some reason, they always seem to grasp at predators as opposed to these landscape level changes that we're seeing. In my position, I would argue that a lot of the problem that we're seeing with low game bird numbers would be attributed to habitat as opposed to predator management. And I always try to explain when you're taking habitat away, it reduces where those game birds can go and predators can more easily find them. With that being said, I don't think predator management is the only tool that we should be looking at. It's a tool in the toolbox, and we should also focus on habitat. So I kind of wanted to get some of your thoughts there.
Oh, no, that's
John.
awesome. And I consider both of those things to be tied very closely together. And in fact, in the predator programs that I've been involved in, we really often talk about predation management rather than things like predator control and that sort of thing. And habitat management is predation management.
Sure.
You create habitat on a landscape, and that does help mitigate, for example, mesomammals and preying on nests and so on. The key comes down to, what are we doing on the landscapes in general and what impact we can have on the landscapes. Mm-hmm. And so I've also spent part of my career in Europe, sure. and just like here, where these are working landscapes. And so you have some control over how much you can do on the landscape. You could, through whatever programs you're involved in, and they have the same challenges we have here where people have to make a living off that landscape. And so you can make habitat, in my mind, that ends up being the foundation of the house.
Sure.
And that's where you really have to start and figure out how you get habitat towards what can be tolerable in that particular landscape. And, sure. and that really depends on the major land use there. So I've worked in forested landscapes where forestry tends to not be quite so dramatic in changing the landscape that agriculture can be. And often you don't hear predator management coming up very often because what Nathan was talking about, that dramatic impact of habitat loss rather than, okay, maybe changing the way some of the habitats are is much less of a problem. And then all of a sudden, predators become less of an issue in some of those landscapes than they would be in ag systems where so much of the landscape is completely changed to a different sort of state. And of course, especially in farmed landscapes, when you're talking about corn and soybeans and the kinds of things that we do here in eastern Nebraska, some of those also tend to promote species like raccoons because we don't manage stream areas or wetland areas the way that was done decades ago. And so a lot of those areas are now supporting much higher populations of species like raccoons than they would have historically. And so you get that sort of double whammy there relative to that whole habitat issue.
Well, I actually, real quick, I was going to say on that, I heard on the Wild Turkey Science podcast, my colleagues Marcus Lashley and Will Goolsby, they talked about feeders and that being something that may help facilitate greater predation in areas, because you have now this, like you're pulling like raccoons. And how often do you see that when you have a feeder out there and then you go and you look at a camera and you have all these images of raccoons and other mesopredators are around those areas. Does that kind of also help facilitate some of these things in addition to, our certain agricultural practices?
Absolutely.
Like having a lot of
especially deer feeders.
So,
now there is feeding done in some parts of the landscape, and we used to do some of it in Georgia, but it was done in quite a different way from the typical way deer would be fed. In fact, in the UK, they've developed feeders that are very species specific. So species like raccoons would have a lot of trouble getting into those kinds of feeders. They call them slit feeders, and they can just get their bill into the feeder to pick out like wheat seeds from the feeder. And so, again, it's one of those things where you think you're trying to do things that will help your species. Well, deer hunters are obviously more interested in deer, but at the same time, you can those management tools can also have a negative impact. And it just shows the complication.
That's true.
And I think a good point that you brought up there, excuse me, is that habitat isn't the same across the board. Habitat isn't the same habitat. So game birds need a different style of habitat. So if landowners are wanting more trees in an area because they say it's going to promote deer populations, well, then we're probably going to see more of those predators, kind of like you were mentioning.
Exactly. And so, somebody pays the price. And sometimes that ends up being game birds. And often what we do in farmed landscapes now, which is quite different from the 1930s, where wildlife was sort of an accidental byproduct of that kind of farming, our farming now makes it much more difficult. And again, though, habitat's important. I'm always foundation of habitat. What are you doing for habitat before you even start thinking about what other tools you might incorporate with predator management or other tools that you might use for predator management. And it's not just predator removal. There are lots of other ways that predators can be managed besides habitat and besides killing them.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can dive into that here in a minute. One of the things I did want to bring up back to your point there, I think that's one of the things I hear a lot is it's like you just kind of immediately go right to that topic. And it's like, hey, at the end of the day, habitat is really important. And I've heard, some people say, well, the biologists are really focused on that. And why is that? Well, why? Because that's usually, in my opinion, one of the, kind of the lowest holes in the bucket you want to be able to plug first, because you got to be able to get, like you said, that foundation, I think is really key. And as especially in these ag dominated landscapes, we're trying to find that balance. We're trying to find ways that we can produce the corn or the soybeans or whatever, but at the same time, find that where you can improve the habitat the best you can. The unfortunate thing is, and I think sometimes, and John, you and I have talked about this, especially with game birds, is really thinking 365 when you're managing them.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of times we get laser focused in to say, like, I'm going to focus on the nesting season, or I'm going to focus on, managing for this cover for this stage of the bird. But really it's that 365 approach. And I guess maybe spend a little time. I wanted to kind of ask your perspectives on that relative to the habitat and kind of your experiences around that 365, and maybe pulling out like species like pheasants or quail or things like that?
Oh,
Any of your past experiences?
Absolutely. And that's where some of my European experiences come to the forefront, because in working with some of my pheasant biologist friends from Europe, they often talk about how we're obsessed with nesting habitat and overly obsessed with nesting habitat, which I think historically probably was a real bottleneck.
Sure.
And, you look at Dick Warner's work back in the 60s, and, even people like Fred Greeley, the intensity at which we did corn and soybean agriculture, and the fact that there was probably a lot more small grains involved.
Sure.
in
Oh,
almost
sure.
all those
Yeah,
landscapes,
absolutely. Yeah.
which allowed,
Yep.
that basically substituted for a lot of good brood rearing habitat,
Sure.
as corn started to get more and more intense. And so we tended to sort of put the guardrails on a bit too much, whereas in the UK, for example, they found that even more than nesting, it was brood survival that was causing
really?
a lot of their
Yeah.
problems. And of course, the intensity of which they manage landscapes is much greater than us, even in wheat landscapes.
Sure.
I was shocked because I was working, for example, in North Dakota back in the 80s, and they were, we're talking about yields of 25, 30 bushels per acre.
Oh,
And then I
yeah.
go to the UK and they're talking about 200 bushels per acre. Yeah,
Wow.
because it was so intensively managed.
Sure.
Herbicides, insecticides, fungicides.
Sure.
And what happened there, and Dick Potts, who was one of my PhD mentors, what he showed was that probably 80% of the decline in partridge, which in some of the other game species, was due to chick survival rather than nest survival,
Sure.
because they could hatch the chicks.
Yeah.
Because they've always done predator management.
Sure.
So, and they've
Yeah.
got that hedgerow system, which is plenty of nesting habitat. But as soon as they would hatch, they go out in these fields that are like wheat and dirt.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and that's where their brood rearing habitat is. They don't raise the broods in the hedgerows, but
Sure.
there's plenty of nesting cover there. And so, you start
point.
thinking about those
Sure.
kinds of things, that it really does get you to understand how to think about the 365.
Sure.
One of the things I've been talking to so many Andy students about is, and looking at their work on pheasants here in Nebraska right now, is I have some theories about winter survival and winter habitat
sure.
here, because if you look at some of the older literature here in this part of the country, often winter survival can be pretty good.
Mhm.
But then you get these events like they're getting in
Sure.
South Dakota yesterday
Yeah,
and today,
yeah,
and some parts of northeast Nebraska are getting buried by snow.
Sure.
And what you would see, what some of Les Flake's data back, I think it was in the 60s, showed that they would do okay for much of the winter because they had enough cover and could get out in fields, and there was enough waste grain and that sort of thing to carry on. But then they would get dumped on by a blizzard that would last 4 or 5 days.
No.
And you would see like 40% mortality of their pheasants during over a week.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you go, okay, so if we forget about those disaster periods, disaster planning,
Sure.
just like with humans, we don't
sure.
plan very
Yeah.
well. The average habitat for winter habitat here is probably okay.
Sure.
But when you get these events like we're getting in northeast Nebraska right now, how much late season mortality are you going to get on a lot of those hens that have made it all the way through the winter? They're getting ready. They're getting ready to try to put on fat reserves for nesting season, and then they just get hammered by that sort of event. And so it really is an interesting way to think about things. You got to think about the average, which we often do with habitat management, but you also have to think about, okay, what happens when we get the unusual that may not occur every winter, but when it does occur, boy, it can knock you back a couple of years.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Good.
Yeah, and I think weather is a topic that doesn't come up enough,
No.
because you're talking winter storms, right? But then in the spring, we have maybe a wet spring
Yep.
where those chicks might not be able to hold their temperatures, or even hail these past few years, especially.
Sure.
Oh yeah, chicks getting hailed out. That's that happens.
Yeah.
And you know, and we're far enough north. One of the things when I was working in Georgia on quail, you tended to not think about temperatures so much on the cold side. There, we actually had to worry about it on the hot side. And we did some research looking at how certain invasive grasses negatively impacted brood habitat, because they would heat up because it gets so warm so early there. You have that intense sun.
Wow.
And it would get to 110 degrees in these areas where hens are trying to forage with broods. Well, you can right after sunrise. But within an hour, it's already getting too hot. And then, so, the ability of these chicks to forage, which they need to do for quite long periods of time when they're young, would drop off. The flip side is here and in parts of Europe where you have a heavy dew in the morning. It's cold. The chicks are wet. And so that combination of poor brood habitat and harder conditions for the chicks to forage in, because the hen's not going to bring her chicks out until she feels that they can get out there and not really because they can't thermal regulate. Get cold. They need to be brooding with mom. And you have those spring conditions here, or early summer conditions, and that really can have a negative impact on your chick survival. So you might have 10 or 12 less than week-old chicks. You get one, a couple days of really wet conditions and cold, and they can't forage, and all of a sudden you're down to half the number of chicks. Even after you've gone through the whole nesting thing.
And that's a good point. And I think, actually, this past Friday, I talked to a group of second graders at my kids' school about habitat. And so it's kind of a fun little connection there. But and so I was asking the kids, what is habitat? And they were telling me food, water, shelter, cover. And so as we kind of went through these things, one of the things we were talking about is amounts. So how much do we need? And we were talking about like gorillas and other different species around the world and why you find them in certain places. And but it really hit me as we were talking through that for the kids and them kind of preparing for this today. I think just also thinking about the amount and proximity of those cover types is also really important. That's back, John, to what you talked about earlier, is like you're doing this 365 approach. One of the questions, and it's interesting to hear that from your perspective on like really hyper focusing on nesting cover, because one of the things even thinking about turkeys right now, that we come back and say nesting, brooder, and cover are kind of those two really key things, and I would agree. But one of the concerns I have is that we get super hyper focused on that, and then we forget about other portions of the year and the requirements. And it's coming back to knowing that. And then as we kind of dive into that more, learning about the birds within those areas. So one of the questions I've asked, even with our current turkey project, is, are these hens, maybe they have great nest survival, but then they don't have maybe as good a brood survival. And so the question is that there's a bottleneck potentially. And then is that hen potentially having to move those chicks from nesting cover, which is different, to some brooding areas, and then it's potentially it's a high risk. And so one of the things, I guess I'll just kind of as a shameless plug for the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab that we're really interested in on the Awesome Lab, as we're actually going to be doing this spring, actually showcasing what is nesting cover, what is brooding cover, where are we finding these species, whether it be pheasants or quail or turkeys, and really to kind of help facilitate. I think from my extension background, that's a big missing piece, because I have landowners that'll, I've engaged with, and they'd take me to a patch of brome grass, say, well, is this, suitable? And it's like, well, that's not really what we're managing for. And so it's like, well, what are we managing for? And giving that educational piece to kind of showcase, here's some, examples. Now, the flip side of all of that is, do we have potential areas that maybe it's just not quality nesting cover, and maybe that's where we have some birds nesting in, but that's all they have on the landscape. So anyway,
that's the key thing that's really pretty interesting here, because that landscape part of it, which your lab is really focusing on, we think about winter habitat, and that tends to be much more spotty on the landscape. Yeah, we put in field margins and we put in grass areas, which is great. And under normal conditions, probably pretty decent
Sure.
winter habitat.
Sure.
But you got to have those really superior winter habitats that I've seen. You know, I've worked on pheasants in North Dakota, and where it's obviously a lot more brutal winters than we have here. And you see a lot of pheasants pile into pretty small areas because that's basically
Sure.
what you have for
That's
the
what you
real
got,
brutal
yeah.
conditions. And you have to be really careful about those, but they can move fairly long distances for those.
Sure.
So, you know, in the fall, when they're moving from where everybody's hunting them to their winter habitat, they can move fairly long distances if needed. And that historical knowledge does help them on the
Sure.
landscape, because they might move, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 miles for that.
Sure.
Wow.
And the
Yeah,
same in the
wow.
spring.
Yeah.
And so what they do in the spring is they do the flip, is they'll move out, spread out from those winter habitats, because there's more area they can use on the landscape.
Sure.
But what they're looking for there, what the males are the ones driving that system, is they're looking for where to set up their breeding territories.
Sure.
And they have fairly specific demands for that. And it's really that's a lot of fun when you
Sure.
go out and do crow counts.
Oh, yeah.
And you actually watch territorial and male
Sure.
trying to attract females to their really good spot, which is usually
Sure.
someplace that's got a backstop of cover, like a shrub line
Mm.
or even tall grass. You know, that's why a lot of Pheasants Forever grass habitats work really good along the edge for male pheasant
Oh, sure.
habitat,
Okay.
because they'll have the open area, which they want to be seen
Sure.
and heard
Yeah.
to the
Sure.
place, but they also want some good cover in case of some Cooper's hawk comes by, and so they
Sure.
can just jump into
Jump
it.
right in
Well,
there,
as it
yeah.
turns out, once the males are there and the females get attracted to those males, the superior males,
Mhm.
which we call territorial
Oh,
males,
sure. Yeah.
and the female will usually nest within about 200 yards of him.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so you want that nesting habitat to be really close to that male territory
Sure.
habitat.
Yeah, that rooster has an important job.
He has a very important job there, because if he puts it on
Sure.
the edge of a wetland that's got like a mile of corn, you know, bare dirt all the way around it,
Sure.
it's going to be pretty difficult
Sure.
for, if you know, she may end up nesting on the edge of the wetland, but then you have all the challenges of nesting in a wetland.
Sure.
And then she doesn't want to go that far from there to nest.
Sure.
And then, of course, you go to the next bottleneck. She gets the brood off. You don't want to take those chicks very far.
Sure.
Pheasant, you know, moving pheasant chicks 100 yards is a long way.
Sure. Yeah.
You want that
Yeah.
brood habitat to be very close there, and that you want them to be able to forage and brood in pretty small areas, because it's been shown that the bigger the area that they have to forage on, the lower the survival rate.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and that's your recruitment for fall season. And it's that first sort of the first week, first 2 weeks, first 3 weeks are all critical. And each week it becomes slightly less problematic, because as soon as they can start to fly,
Sure.
and as soon as they become stronger flyers, they can forage over much larger areas, and they don't need to brood from the hen. You know, once they get to a couple weeks and they can start to thermoregulate,
Sure.
then it becomes
Yep.
less critical. But early on, you can often get, you know, 30, 40, 50% mortality. And that's a killer on your recruitment.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, in the fall, they have lots of places to go, because you got all the cornfields, the soybean fields everywhere,
Oh, yeah.
habitat everywhere.
Yeah.
And of course, that's when hunters see them in
Sure.
the fall.
Yeah.
They're spread all over the countryside, and they don't realize that that's a particularly good time of the year
Yeah.
to be a pheasant.
Well, and
Other
that,
than getting
well, and
shot.
I think that's an important point, because I hear that a lot. Is, you know, okay, I'm a hunter, I'm out there in the field, and that's the assumption that is what they need 365.
Exactly.
And it's like, no, that's a component of their life
Mhm.
history and kind of that time throughout
Yep.
the year. And so that's changing. And so I know Pheasants Forever, for example, it has different ways they can kind of help facilitate with landowners getting those brood mixes and nesting mixes in kind of that proximity. But that's the point, is kind of, and I think that, John, you and I've talked about this before. That's one thing I think that hasn't been explored a lot here in the United States compared to the UK, is the territoriality of pheasants, particularly. And I know we could go on a whole long time with that.
We could do another podcast. It's actually a lot of fun,
I think,
because I really like that, and it's a fun time of the year to see. Pheasants.
But I think the point coming out of that, coming back to this habitat and the predator management side of things, is literally, you know, you're thinking about that species, the ecology of that species, and thinking about their proximity and understanding what requirements they need. So like you were mentioning, 200 yards potentially, or 200 meters from those locations, that's pretty important. So obviously you start building that knowledge out from a landowner standpoint. If I want to have more pheasants, that's usually the proverbial, I want to have more pheasants, or I want to have more quail, or I want to have more of this. What do I do to facilitate that? But understanding the science, I think, is really important, so they can kind of incorporate that in their management program.
And it's exactly why I have a little note to myself here to remind myself to say, this is why we need to know a lot more about game bird biology.
Sure. Yeah.
People go, well, people have been researching game birds for 100 years now, but there's still lots of things that we don't quite understand.
Sure.
I always joke in fact, I was joking with the Pop Dye students this morning. Well, this is not rocket science. It's actually a lot harder because at least rockets follow rules. And with living animals, it's actually more complicated because of all the nuanced decisions that they make, despite the fact that they're bird brains. They still actually make decisions, but they don't always make the best decisions. And on how they do things. And so it becomes very nuanced at times. And it's also why both habitat management and if you get into predation management, both of those things can fail badly. And you can invest a lot of money in those things where you put a lot of habitat out and you get nothing. Because you don't recognize what is actually the habitat that's the missing there. In that
and that's really what facilitated Allie and Megan's project. John's on their committees and thinking about how do we identify and prioritize areas, because I know there were portions of the state that they were saying, hey, you're working with landowners in these areas, and you have places that are seem to be working really well. What is that about that? Them? And those complexes that we can help maybe, replicate some of those things, but also knowing that even just going from like west to east part of the state, requirements are going to be different. And so just a model, and that's, I think the important, a lot of times you look at projects, it's like, well, you do another project just on that same species, just a few counties over, but things are going to be very different. And that's the importance of it. So,
one of the big things out west is, I go out there, and it reminds me of the places I worked in North Dakota on pheasants. Where there were a lot of pheasants. And, if you have a percentage of wheat on the landscape, it does make a difference for pheasants, because wheat can't, no matter what you do, wheat generally is not managed as intensively as corn or even soybeans. Although soybeans, there's some things you can do there that I think that are easier than with corn. Is that, you get it, what I think a lot of people fail to understand on the habitat side with broods is it's not the wheat that produces the insects that they forage on. It's often the weeds. Often in wheat, you tolerate some level of broadleaf forbs in your wheat field because it's not worth spraying for them. That actually produces a lot of habitat for game bird chicks, and it makes it superior habitat. In fact, I've thought about that in Nebraska. I wonder if there is a place for conservation strategies to add a wheat component to some of these areas that are just so much corn and soybeans, and including allowing the landowner to harvest it as a crop. So, that's something that I've thought about on the habitat side, but we're digressing a little bit. We go really into habitat.
I think it's good, but good.
And I'll just make a quick point here. We agree that small grains, that winter cereal in the rotation, is a necessity. So we actually have, we being Pheasants Forever and even the NRCS, through a number of programs, have cost share and different funding opportunities for landowners to bring that winter cereal back into the cropping rotation,
which is awesome.
Diversify the landscape.
And of course, what we need probably are more plot studies looking at what's being produced for things besides the wheat in those fields that might make them much better for game birds.
Good point.
Game bird foraging, but. Reeling us back into predation management, because I've done a lot of it, and I do think that there is a place for it in the Midwest. I'm just going to give you a little bit of history.
That sounds great.
So if we think about people like Paul Arrington and Aldo Leopold, they are the early part of the 20th century. Those two people basically invented modern wildlife management in North America. One was a professor at University of Wisconsin. The other was at University of Iowa. Oh, no, sorry, Iowa State. Sorry, Iowa State guy. But, you think about inventing our profession was done in this landscape.
Yeah.
In this Midwest ag landscape. What they saw, what Aldo Leopold saw in his career was, and it's going right back to the 1920s, was he saw this mentality of, well, with predators, any kind of predators, especially mammalian predators, kill them all, let God sort them out. That was the attitude. And, being a very smart man and being involved in that at some level, he saw the Kaibab Plateau deer fiasco. He saw the wolf issue in New Mexico when he was working in New Mexico. And it just sort of changed his thinking about this from farming wildlife to sort of thinking about it in an ecology sort of sense. And they had a huge influence on how things were done. And of course, thinking back to those days, how was it done? I lived in North Dakota for quite a while. And of course, talking to the old biologists from a long time ago who were, sort of active during World War II in that era. I mean, they were dropping strychnine fat balls from airplanes. They would just fly transects across the state, dropping strychnine balls out. Wow. And so you can imagine what that did to the landscape. Including killing all the farmers' dogs, too. You start thinking about, I've seen lots of photos from this part of the world with planes with skis on them where aerial hunting of things like coyotes and fox were just... It was done as a sport, but it was also done as predator control. And I'm using that term very explicitly there. And then there was the bounty situation. And there were bounties everywhere. And I remember in my lifetime, bounties still existing in various parts of the country. And I'm sure if somebody looked in the history books, you could find when the last sorts of bounties started to go away in the United States. And especially later on, it was mostly to support game birds because, of course, starting in the 30s, the heyday of pheasants, and then there's been some bumps up, but it's generally been much lower populations. And so, of course, you get sort of that flip from kill them all mentality to kill them all for something like supporting game bird research.
Well, I think it's also important there to have that key of, because when I hear predator control, predator management, it's also specifying what are those predators, because there are obviously a suite of predators for some of these species that you cannot legally harvest.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it's always good to say that. And thinking in most cases we're talking about those mesopredators. So and thinking about things like coyotes, for example, or foxes. And so I think it's good, and I wanted to plug that in there.
Absolutely.
Because I think there's this kind of assumption like predator control, we're going to take and remove all possible predators out there.
So let's flip now. Okay, so in the 1960s and 70s, there started to be some interest. And of course, Arrington and Aldo Leopold had a huge impact on how wildlife management was taught. And then it became, the pendulum sort of swung. Habitat. Everything was habitat. And of course, it's easy for people to grab onto, and it's good, and it's important. And then there were, especially some of the duck biologists started, and of course, they were only dealing with ducks in the northern plains for part of the year, the nesting season. And so there was sort of this narrow focus in on that. But when you look at what the northern prairie guys did in the starting probably in the 60s, or maybe mainly in the 70s and into the 80s, and then Delta Waterfowl Research Station, they started looking at a lot of different aspects of predation on ducks, because of course everybody's concerned about ducks dropping off. And of course, to summarize hundreds and hundreds of research projects into about 30 seconds here, what they found is, predator control can work, or predator management. And they were basically looking at, in some of their studies, removing predators from landscapes, especially in areas with a lot of nesting cover, just prior to the nesting season. And there's a key there, because that's the time of the year when females are getting ready to den, all of that. And so the predators aren't moving around on the landscape. They're basically staying home. And so people say, well, trapping will, fall, winter trapping will do a lot of good. Actually, it doesn't do that much good because the animals have a lot of opportunity to move for long periods of time before that too. So there's a pretty narrow window there going into nesting season. But what they found is it's actually not rocket science once again. Again, much more complicated because in areas where they do things like control coyotes, or coyotes are naturally less common, red fox tend to take off. And as it turns out, red fox are really good game bird nest predators. And coyotes are not. And even when coyotes take an occasional nest, their territories are so big, one pair of coyotes can keep out 2 or 3 or 4 pairs of red fox because coyotes will just kill every red fox they see. In the South, when I was working there, I even had hunters relay to me, because of everybody there hunts from tree stands, watching coyotes going after raccoons. And what it seemed to do there is change raccoon behavior. They weren't foraging around out in the nesting cover areas quite as much because you had to be they had to be watching over their back for a coyote to snag them. And so it's kind of interesting, these dynamics. So if you remove coyotes, you release red fox, and then your duck nesting drops off.
Interesting.
And so I worked on some projects early in the 80s. That's when I first started doing predation research. And unfortunately, that wasn't quite there yet. And they controlled the whole suite of mesomammalian predators. And of course, that resulted in, with a place that had fantastic habitat, resulted in some of the better populations.
And I think that's important. It's not that we're saying that predator management doesn't work. It works. It's just the context. I think you made the point, Nathan, earlier. It's like it's a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox. And so it's like there's a time and a place for that. And
sometimes it'll work, and sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes it works really well. And sometimes it works marginally.
And I think, and that's why, like, I always go back to that point, and not to get back on the topic of habitat, but that's where I go back a lot and say, have you addressed that first? If you have if you don't have high quality nesting cover, or brood rearing cover, we need to think about these different cover types at 365 approach. If you haven't done that, then I would not spend your resources, your time, money, all your treasures out there on that at the moment on predator management. I would take and go back and say, focus on the habitat first, then add in that.
If they have no place to live, then it doesn't do any good removing those predators anyways. And so, so thinking about this again more broadly, after a lot of my experiences in the 70s and 80s here and in Europe and elsewhere, one of the things that it's important to think about here is we don't even talk about predator management. We talk about managing predation. And I think that's what we have to get through folks' heads. Because there's a tendency especially among hunters, is like, well, if I kill a raccoon or I kill a coyote or I kill a fox, that equals X number of new pheasants that join our population. And basically they're treating it as an arithmetic problem. 1 + 1 = 2.
And it's not that.
Remove the negative. And as it turns out, again, it's more complicated than that, because for one, we have a predator suite. And not all predators are on the table. We do not, for my whole career, raptors are out of the question, and it's the same in Europe. They cannot, even though they very much buy into predator management or predation management, they can't control predators either, or raptors either. And so that's off the table. But it's also a lot more complicated. Because even in a place like Nebraska, we have a whole suite of predators. Okay, I have less experience with that than in Georgia, where we had a lot more experience because much larger number of studies there. In Georgia, there are 45 different species of predators on bobwhite quail.
Wow.
Okay, so you start adding all those up. If you're only removing, say, mesomammals, there's a whole suite of other kinds of predators that might do something like compensate for predation, including things like fire ants. One of the things we found when we did predation predator removal in areas is predator, mesopredator mortality on nests decreased, but what you ended up seeing was a higher or an increase in things like fire ant predation on nests. And you go, wow, that's kind of weird. And it actually isn't weird, because what happened is survival of the nest would last longer. In fact, they would get all the way up to the stage in which they're pipping the eggs. And of course, that's when the fire ants are hitting them right at the end of nesting, because fire ants can't get into the eggs. So it's when they pip, and we would find pipped eggs with a little skeleton inside.
Really?
Yeah, because they, and so that sort of thing.
Sure.
So we did a lot of work on compensatory mortality from different predators, and then you can make, especially in a place like that, you start to get the nuances. Well, we actually had more nests out of 900 quail nests that we had video monitors on. We had more nests depredated by white-tailed deer than we did coyotes.
Really?
Now, was that on accident, or?
What do you mean?
No,
the deer it's mostly does in the summer, and I think that they're depredating the nests the same way they eat the placenta, and they'll eat small mammals and things like that for females to pick up protein. Okay, granted, both of them were really small percentages.
Yeah.
They're really small, but it makes the point that, yes, we're in an area that didn't have a huge coyote population, but they're still there, and fair number of deer. But you'd see the does come in, kick the female off the nest, and actually you would see her on the video camera eating the quail eggs like little jelly beans. It was awesome. You'd see their tongue just popping these little jelly beans of quail eggs into their mouth. Yeah, and I think it's simply, when they're having dropping the fawns, and they're trying to pick up whatever extra they can. Not going to get from foraging. Normal foraging.
So not a common thing, but just kind of you would have occurrences like that. And I think that's important to. Well, I think it goes back to speak to ultimately. When you're managing these species, these game birds, for example, you're managing for all, you have all these different moving pieces.
Yes.
And it's, we think about the food web, and it's like, I always say to students, like you adjust one thing and then everything else adjusts. And I think that's back to your rocket science.
You get these domino effects.
And you get all these other changes, and it's like, and some of them very unanticipated, and you're sitting there going, well, I didn't really think that was going to happen. So that's why it makes it really complicated.
It happens with all our management, including habitat management.
Oh, yeah.
Which is why I'm always harping on thinking hard about not a prescription, that we have a suite of different management options. And I think Pheasants Forever has really got onto that more recently in terms of trying to think about the 365 and, what do you need to have in proximity to each other for habitat to have the most impact. And I think what they found in the old days is they would put in a bunch of habitat and there would be no positive response. And it's because there was that disconnect. Okay, so now getting back to the predation thing, one of the arguments I would make here is that doing predation management is a whole potential suite of things that you could do, but it often includes removal of predators. That's expensive. Unless you have somebody who does it for free. And it's also, there are some legal constraints. In fact, in Georgia, when I lived there, they did change the law on allowing for individual plantations down there to do some predator management in April and May, going into the breeding season. But they had to apply for a permit to do it. And the permit wasn't just give your money. It was to write a whole management plan on how that fit into your habitat management program. And it was actually quite effective because somebody had to be really serious about it to consider doing it. It was legal, but you had to, everybody knows the stakes were raised. And so that meant that you did it if you were really serious about your game bird management. And here, I think probably the same sort of thing could be done, but it would be on a case-by-case basis. So this idea of having, say, a bounty on mesomammals during April, May, which there's been some pressure to do in some places. I think that it's sort of a waste of time because you basically are, I think the example from not too far away from here in another state, is that, they're taking one predator per square mile or
Sure.
something in that
Yeah.
vicinity. And
Yeah.
you're going, well, that's not going to do
Yeah.
it because it's not an arithmetic problem.
Yeah.
You might, that one predator, which you pay a lot of money to get a tail, means that theoretically it might have depredated a game bird nest, but may
Yeah.
have not.
Yeah.
So it's, that's
Well,
a large
and
investment of
that's
money with not
sure.
very much
Well, and I
return.
think the point there too is that you need to have a landscape level, multi-property perspective of doing
Yeah.
that. And so thinking historically in the 1800s, you would have had that because there obviously was a fur market during that
Yes.
time and even the early 1900s.
Yeah.
And so, but now you don't see that. And so
No.
then it's, one of the things I've seen is that somebody does a lot of intensive trapping on their property, but their neighbors don't. And then it's like, well, and then they go back and they say, well, I go back to that same place the next year and I feel like nothing's really changed.
Well,
and it's like, well, because you have kind of, this, kind of, I always say,
it's
the sink source type thing. Yeah. Sink source, you got, these source populations. And
Yeah.
now you're basically creating this sink where now you're going to fill that void
Yeah.
by other neighboring mesopredators. And so, the point is that, and this is why we also in our lab work a lot in the realm of conservation cooperatives.
Yep.
Because I think that's really important. We need to have a landscape level perspective and we need to be able to work with our neighbors. Maybe we don't all have the same objectives and that's totally fine. But having
working
together can make a big difference.
Well, and the key, that's a really good key point there. Part of this idea of predation management compared to the old days of dropping strychnine balls is that nobody wants to get rid of these species. They're part of the species biodiversity and are part of our landscape. They're important parts of our landscape.
Yep.
And they should be on the landscape.
Sure.
And so one of the things that we've talked about over the last decade or so is that we don't necessarily want to get rid of them. What you want to do is create holes in the landscape for a very short period of time.
Sure.
So if you have an area where you're intensively managing for game birds, and especially nesting and brood rearing, and you create a hole just as you're going into the nesting season, that's perfect. Because at that time of the year, you're not getting dispersal of fox or raccoons from the neighbor's property.
Yep.
But in September time, they're going to be moving back over. So by next spring, you're probably going to have those predators back again. So it means you still have to do it again.
Correct. Yeah.
Probably at a lower level.
Yeah.
And in addition, you have to be very careful because, of course, if you start removing, say, all the coyotes in an area, you disrupt all of these territoriality behaviors, and that might end up causing you some problems too, because you disrupt the coyote territories while that allows fox to move in from some other areas, and especially in these ag landscapes where it's important. Now, obviously in cattle country where there's not that many pheasants anyways, there are different considerations there.
Yeah.
And obviously, and we're not talking about people who are controlling coyotes because they want to keep them off of calves and that sort of thing. That's a completely different objective. And we're talking about somebody who might have a farm or a couple farms where they could get together and they've done really good habitat management and they want to bring it up another notch. But you're still talking about percentages of improvement.
Correct.
Yeah. And so, for example, when we worked on our big predation experiment in Georgia, our fall recruitment, by adding the predation management on top of the habitat work, was about 20% per year on average. It was about an extra 20% quail on the landscape. Now, it was pretty expensive to do that, but obviously in those landscapes with the people who are working on those landscapes, quail are extremely important. It's part of the culture. They're willing to do that. There's no problem with that. And I think that you'll see spots in places like Nebraska where you have a group of landowners who will be interested in that. My friend in Austria, who has some of the best pheasant populations in the world, and who I talked about it at the Pheasants Forever conference, he loves his pheasants. And he's the only one who manages for pheasants in that area, but he owns, I forget what the exact size of the estate was. I think I told you guys, but I don't remember. I think it was around 5,000 acres.
And it was interesting because it looked very similar to a lot of the landscapes around here. Yeah.
But he had some really good habitat.
Yeah.
He had some very good winter habitat, a lot of wetlands. And when his populations were dropping off because his father, the previous count, had drained all the wetlands, he got an EU grant to actually put in wetlands from the Puka River. And he did it in a way that minimized the impact on his agricultural activities. But what it did is it provided a lot better option for pheasants during the winter, because their winters are like ours. Not a killer, but they get these really bad blizzards. And a lot of their pheasant winter habitats in woodland areas.
Oh, sure.
And you know, and of course they're maturing in his landscape. They don't do as much coppicing. They coppice to make posts for the vineyards.
Oh, sure.
And so they haven't done as much as they used to. And so a lot of them are getting overgrown, and there's not as much understory, all of that. And when they started putting these wetlands in, what they found is that pheasants had a lot more places to spend the winter. And a lot of those places were much closer to some of their really good nesting and brood rearing habitat, instead of having to move all the way across the state to get there. And so, that's
well, that's interesting.
It is. It just shows what, you know, one person's motivation can do. Because otherwise, it's pretty much, you know, his neighbors just shoot his pheasants, and they don't really do much because they're deer hunters and wild boar hunters, and pheasants have sort of dropped off the radar for them.
And just in case we have a dedicated landowner listening to the podcast, can you explain what size of an area and how many traps you're looking at when you were getting that 20% increase?
Oh, well, we were talking. Okay, let me pull out some of my stats here. I hope I have them. I think we were talking about at least a couple thousand acres in each of our. So we did it as an experimental model. So we took parts of plantations in Georgia to get that. I think there were all about 1,000 to 1,500 hectares. So what do we talk? 2,500 acres, something like that. And we were talking about full-time trapper. During that time of the year, full-time trapper.
And I think that's important.
That's important.
Very
important. Investment.
Absolutely.
Now, I've talked to landowners in Nebraska who, you know, sort of getting to retirement age, old guys like me, and they go, I'm willing to put out a bunch of traps and do that sort of thing. That there is the potential of doing it without having to hire full-time and so on. But it is a big investment to get that kind of response. Now, does that response translate directly from Georgia to here? Probably not exactly, because of course we had a lot more of everything. A lot more predators, a lot more prey, a lot more alternative prey. Here it's a much simpler system. And so it may not be quite that, but I don't think anybody's really seriously looked here. We did a little bit of pheasant predation management back in the early 80s in North Dakota, but that was a very unique situation, island sort of situation where, where of course up there, fox and coyotes and raccoons can move, and skunks can move right across the ice for 5 months of the year. And so, you know, that even though it was a lot of predator control in the winter, they could still get back on the island. And so it was a unique situation. Wasn't control study. I didn't design it. I was just a student doing some work on it, but it sort of got me into this idea that there are different ways to skin the cat.
Well, and I think that's I guess kind of as we're getting close to wrapping up here, thinking about with the context of those predator management studies, and I've been reading through that, and it's interesting. You like you said, John, you have some that show support for that, some that show it doesn't, and some that are kind of in the mix. And I think the thing is each of them are very context specific.
Exactly.
And you got to understand that system, which is why we have a study area description when we describe these studies in these peer-reviewed papers, because I think it's really important to understand that context. And that it's easy, to potentially go out and say, well, this one study said it, so therefore it should apply. And it's like, well, in reality, it doesn't. And I think it's important to kind of show that example. Does Georgia translate here? Possibly, maybe not. And ultimately, the more that we understand about the ecology of these species through these various studies, the more that we can improve that management.
I think it translates for understanding biology and interactions of species, but the landscape context is so different.
Yeah.
I think that you lose a lot. And thinking about that here, doing serious predation experiments in this part of the world is probably something that could be done now under modern landscape conditions and management conditions. But the thing to remember about that is it's also doing research on top of just doing predator management.
Yeah.
Doing predator research.
Yeah.
Well, habitat research is expensive enough. Andy knows about that right now. He's doing a lot of landscape work.
Yeah.
You add a lot of layer of expense on there to try to do it right in a scientific way. Again, it becomes very complicated. We had a huge study areas with control and treatments where predation management was flipped over 3-year periods.
Yeah.
And it was the study was 6 years long.
Interesting.
Wow.
And we felt like it wasn't even close to being long enough to get the nuances. Why? Because one year, one of our control areas had a big canine distemper outbreak.
Oh.
All of a sudden, a whole which impacts raccoons too.
Sure.
All of a sudden, predator populations drop to nothing because of natural conditions. You're going, okay, that messes up our control because this was the time when predators were supposed to be just running rampant. And so you end up having to take some of those things that you don't have control of into account. And it makes it really messy.
Well, and that actually maybe is a good segue as we kind of wrap up to say one of the other episodes we're going to be taping is basically better understanding research. I think that's one of the things it's hard to make unless you're kind of in our realm that we do this all the time to understand, like, especially you mentioned the expense. It's like, why do these projects cost so much? And again, we can dive into that later on. But the point is that, the more we do these studies, and I think the other thing too is it adds into that is the length of time. You said, 6 years?
We did it for 6 years.
So you're, and we want immediate. We live, the society we live in, we obviously want everything instantaneous. And so, I'm a very impatient person. And so I think it's hard to wait around for 6 years to get results. But I think the point there is that you start to look at year-to-year variation as well, like you just mentioned with the canine distemper. And so there's a lot of components. That's why it gets so complicated. And it's like, everybody I think would love to have an easy option, but it's just not that. It's very complicated.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I would just say that my takeaway from today is that as researchers, it's very important once you have the information to get it out there to landowners in a way that's easily understandable and applicable. And because one of the things that I learned was that fox will actually outcompete coyotes as far as nest predation. I didn't know that. And I would say tying in a social aspect of it, I would say folks like to see fox on the landscape a lot more than they like to see coyotes.
And it's a cultural context.
Yeah.
But the funny thing about, being in the quail world is in Texas, they don't really have red fox the way we do here in ranch country there. And they have some weird dynamics on their quail management, which was completely different from quail interactions in the Southeast. And I think it's because they were managing quail on a ranch context, not on a plantation context.
Oh,
quite different. And so again, really interesting.
And one other question that I just have to ask. How much predation do we see from turkeys on our game birds? A question that I get asked all the time.
I get that too. Yeah.
I did my master's on turkeys back when there weren't in the Daniel Boone National Forest when there was almost none. And you can blame me because my project was a restoration project. And so, we used to get that all the time with quail in the Southeast. And we go, there's a lot more quail and a lot more turkeys there. And I would say almost infinitesimally small. They, they'll eat chicks. People have seen turkeys eating quail chicks, but I've also seen white-tailed deer eating quail eggs. And so context of, 3 deer eating quail nests out of 900.
Yeah.
Probably not something you ought to be obsessing about.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing with turkeys. Yeah. And of course, only if they happen to intersect at the right time. No turkey's ever going to be foraging for quail chicks or pheasant chicks. And often they're fairly different habitats at that time of the year. I would say I'm not worrying about it at all.
Yeah. Well, and I think when you start looking at the trends, and I'll use the example here within the Midwest and Nebraska, maybe specifically. So here, turkey wise, we've seen about a 45% decline in turkey since 2009. Similarly, we've also seen that with pheasants. We've seen similar declines, maybe not necessarily 45%, but the numbers are, the point is we've seen that decline there for those other game birds at the same time, concurrent. And so what is one of the common denominators out of that? It's just a lack of habitat. And I think that's, I'm going to make the selfish, pitch back to my lab because I always have to do that. But that's one of the things I really pride ourselves on our labs of finding that balance because it is, and somebody said the other day, it's like, well, can you apply the same management regime working with biologists of one property to the next? And I said, no, ultimately there is no cookie cutter approach that can apply everywhere. Yeah. The thing is that, and that's why you have like Pheasants Forever, for example, or Nebraska Game and Parks Commission biologists that can go out and meet with landowners and meet with them and decide on what those objectives are for that landowner and find ways to create that balance, especially in these ag-dominated areas where a producer at the end of the day, that their main bottom line is ag production, whether that's ranching or row crop production. And then a lot of the ones that I meet say, well, I love to go out and pheasant hunt, or I love to go out and quail hunt or whatever. And so it's how can I get that back? Because I've seen those numbers, maybe some of those older individuals talk about from back in the 60s and 70s. And it's like, I want to be able to get back to some of those. And it's like, well, okay, well, there's been a lot of changes. So, I think it's something I commonly, I think maybe my first, month or two in the job, I got that question.
It really is an interesting one. And it also is based on the outcomes.
Sure.
In the United States, we can be, our outcomes expectations are going to be a bit more modest, especially in the Midwest, on the kinds of, hunting opportunities because of the way hunting is done here.
Yeah, true.
If you're on a plantation in Georgia, there's huge investment, but there's a serious local social culture around having much higher populations of quail. And in Europe is absolutely, there is that context. So for example, driven shooting in Europe, you have to have a lot more birds on the ground in order to make it worth doing.
Make it work. That makes sense.
And so, they have to manage much more intensively, and it's part of that culture. Where here, I would be perfectly happy to take a dog out and kill a pheasant once in a while. And so that, that sort of mentality, I think, is much more common in our landscape here than in some of these other situations where things like predation management is, at a much higher level.
Yeah, no, that's good. Well, Nate, you want to wrap us up?
No, I think that was a great conversation, and I really appreciate picking your brain, Dr. Carroll. I had about 1,000 questions that kept rolling.
Yeah, I think we'll have to have him back on so we can dive into, because this is really a multi-episode type thing, because there's so many different intricacies that we could get into. I really want to get into talking about like territoriality of male pheasants at some point.
Yes, because
I think there's a lot of applicability there to manage.
I have a lot of views on pheasants. I've worked in pheasants, and I forget what I told everybody, but 6, 7, 8 countries in different parts of the United States. I have a lot of views on it that don't necessarily align with everybody else in any particular location because I've seen pheasants are pheasants. Pheasant biology in Europe is exactly the same as it is here. It's the other sorts of contexts that change those working relationships. Yeah. It's really pretty neat.
That's
for sure. Make sure you keep an eye on your email for the next invite.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. That sounds good.
Thanks,
for anybody who is out there and wants to email us with questions, they can email us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com with questions, and we can pass them along to Dr. Carroll. And again, thank you so much. Appreciate you join us today. And
thank you, sir.
Great talking to
absolutely.
you guys. It was awesome.
All right. Sounds good. We'll see you all later.
See you, everyone. Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
and we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.